Mr. Topher Field!
Joining me now is that inspiring and brave Australian documentary filmmaker, Topher Field.
Melbourne, my home. What unfolded here shocked the world and caused many to wonder what happened to Australia. In the middle of it all were ordinary people, people like us. My name is Topher Field. I'm the director of Battleground Melbourne.
Topher is on a mission to empower people.
The only thing that limits government power is the limit of our obedience.
But we realized a deeper truth, that good people break bad laws.
Moral cowardice is the great scourge of our time.
We're here to take back the freedoms that were earned for us by the people that we built this shrine to remember.
This was a military checkpoint. They had the army on these checkpoints. And without irony, saying, papers, please. Our boys in blue wouldn't obey a government tyranny. Excuse me, they will.
Yes.
I understood that my arrest was coming, and I by then I was on the verge of a breakdown.
Hi everyone, Rukshan here, and quick video to alert you to the arrest of Topher Field.
The problem with Australians is not that so many of them are descended from convicts, but that so many are descended from prison officers.
I went as far on one occasion as to saying, yeah, you're absolutely right, I'm inciting. I'm inciting people to exercise their human rights.
And I will accept nothing less than freedom. Freedom for me, freedom for my children, and freedom for us all.
Hello and welcome to another Topher Field podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on this Thursday night. We have our live audience as we always do. Tim, thanks for saying g'day. G'day to yourself. How are you going? And I bet it's very, very cold where you are. And to Adam, how are we all? Another great chat ahead. Indeed, it is always a great chat. If you've ever listened to tonight's guest Ramesh, on anyone else's podcast, you'll know he's a fantastic guest to have. And I tell you what, I'm looking forward to tonight. I only met Ramesh relatively recently. It was actually thanks to the Australian Medical Professional Society. I got to MC an event where they brought Dr. John Campbell out to Australia. I had the pleasure and honour of MCing that particular event, and I met Dr. John Campbell, which was great. But I also met lots of other fantastic people, Ramesh being one of them. We then bumped into each other again in Melbourne for a summit that he was involved in, and I very much enjoyed listening to him and learning from his experience. This is a man who has seen the inside, the belly of the beast, the Assistant Secretary General to the UN, former. Of course, for reasons that I'm sure we will get to and we will discuss. Now, we've got lots of your comments coming in. Net Zero, I am indeed wearing my Net Zero hoodie. You can get all of my merch, including this hoodie, or in a t-shirt form from goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com if you are so inclined. Mr. Stu is here. Oops, if I can just click on the correct one there. Mark, good to have you here. All right, so Sandra has got the right idea. Watching from Mornington Peninsula. So Sandra, you're letting us know where she's watching from. Thank you very, very much. Now, I'm worried about my audio tonight, so sound is a bit crackly. We've got the same problem again. All right, there's not much I can do, but we had this problem last week. I wanted to give my gear a second chance to see whether it would improve, because here's the devil's choice here. Can everyone jump in the comments? Let me know if you're finding it crackly as well, or whether it's okay to you. Sound is crackly. Okay, so we're getting confirmation. Your sound is crackly. Fixed it. No, I don't think I did. All right, I'm getting mixed messages here, guys. Mixed messages. Tell me what's going on, because I can put my earbuds away and just use the microphone on the phone, which is what's doing the camera work for me. The problem is that the audio volume goes down very, very low. Okay, sound is good again. I'm getting lots of messages now. Good now. I will try not to touch them. They try to come out of my ear. I'll try not to touch them. Okay, enough about my sound. Let's talk about my guest. My guest tonight is Ramesh Thakur. He is, let me just get this here, a Brownstone Institute senior scholar, and I'm going to put a link up actually to all of his Brownstone Institute articles because they are well worth reading. In fact, let me do that right now. Here we go. I'm dropping a link into the comments. It should show up on any platform, whether you're watching on YouTube, on Facebook, or I think on X. It'll also come up, but maybe not on X. It might not be integrated, but certainly on YouTube or Facebook, you should have there should be a link that just popped in there for you. And so Ramesh Thakur is a Brownstone Institute senior scholar, is a former United Nations Assistant Secretary General. Yes, this man comes to us directly from the belly of the beast, and emeritus professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy. Alrighty, so without further ado, shall we get him on? I think we should. Would you please join me in welcoming our guest tonight, which is Ramesh Thakur. Thank you so much for joining us, Ramesh, and taking time out of your evening.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Mate, the pleasure is definitely all mine. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to your remarks that night in the drinks after party, I believe it was, after the John Campbell event in Sydney, and then listening to your remarks and your cutting wit at the press conference in Melbourne, which I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you again. And I immediately went up to you afterwards and I said, hey, can I get you on to my podcast? And you graciously accepted. So here we are. There are a lot of different topics I would like to discuss with you, but we don't have 5 hours, which is my record for a slow chat. I'm not trying to break that record tonight. In fact, I don't think I can stay awake that long. I go to bed earlier now than what I did during COVID. But you have been involved in nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. You have been involved in writing a new doctrine of governance and the responsibility to protect, if I'm remembering the terminology correctly. You have been involved in so many different aspects of public life, public policy at an international level, and you have also been one of the earliest and, in my opinion, most outspoken public figures when it came to criticizing the government's COVID reaction. And that I find particularly interesting. It's interesting in its own right, but it's particularly interesting in light of your background. You come from having worked inside the UN. So can we start with COVID? What was it that you saw that gave you the confidence to criticize the government's response when so many of what would be your colleagues or former colleagues were actually the ones driving that response? What did you see that they couldn't?
That's a good question. I think we have to start with the fact that when COVID was declared a pandemic, I was already retired from university. And I meant by retirement, I had disengaged quite deliberately. And part of that was moving out of Canberra physically. So it was a complete break. But that meant two things. Firstly, I had the time and the freedom to explore any topics. And that's what I was doing. I had fulfilled all my existing obligations and was free to do whatever I wanted. But the second thing was I couldn't be fired. I had already retired. But there was a third element as well, and that is that for decades, I had been involved in public debate in both print media and electronic by way of opinion articles and interviews. And indeed, I wrote more than 50 op-eds, as they're called, for what used to be called the International Herald Tribune, which was easily the most influential newspaper around the world. More than 50 as a senior UN official, not one of which was vetted in advance. That's not happened before. It's not going to happen again. So that might be my biggest claim. So that was that element. Secondly, funnily enough, my primary responsibility for about a decade in the UN system was to bring together the worlds of scholarship and international policy. International policy principally for the UN, but developed with a view to getting them across to member states, governments. And as part of that, from, shall we say, a global governance perspective, I had looked at health in a number of different contexts. One of which was we actually encouraged governments not to forget that a severe pandemic was a low probability, but high impact, realistic contingency. And so we needed to be prepared in advance, have in place the infrastructure to allow us to go into a surge capacity mode to ramp up health defenses if one broke out. And the center of the architecture of global governance on health was the WHO. Secondly, we, as part of the United Nations University, established a new institute, a new global institute, which we located in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, which was on global health. And I was involved in that establishment. So I looked at the whole issue of the interaction between the high income developed industrialized countries and their first world public health infrastructure, and the lack of the same in developing countries. And Malaysia is an interesting case where, while still essentially a developing country, as far as the public health infrastructure was concerned, it had already, under Dr. Mahathir, and he was a medical doctor after all, achieved quite spectacular results in terms of the other developing countries. And therefore, their example was far more relevant to the main countries that were our constituency and are also the constituency of the WHO. So that was the second factor. The third way in which I had been involved was there was a small group in Canada under the leadership of former Prime Minister Paul Martin that was already looking at the merits of, the feasibility of, and if possible, how to do it, elevating what was then the finance ministers G20 to a leaders level G20. The finance ministers G20 was set up while Paul Martin was finance minister of Canada. He and Larry Summers from the US did that together. And then as prime minister, he got interested in that. Based on his experience that a small group of equal level ministers, in this case leaders, interacting together informally could perhaps broker deals which could then be tasked to their respective bureaucracies to formulate policy and get formal agreements and then get it ratified by the UN. So I was familiar, and part of that was looking also at pandemics. So we had looked at all that. And because of that, I was familiar with a report that was published by the WHO in September 2019. So we're just looking at 2 to 4 months before the pandemic breaks out. And that report summarized a century's worth of science, data, and experience from around the world, and came up with the recommendations on both what not to do and what we should do. And pretty much all the things they said we should not do was suddenly implemented in 2020. So I said, no, wait a minute. Science doesn't work like that. It doesn't flip overnight. You need a whole series of studies and hypotheses to be tested. And in the meantime, you stay with your existing things. Then I looked around because I had the freedom, and I looked at existing pandemic preparedness plans in the UK, in Canada, in the US, and in Australia. And all of them reflected and echoed what the WHO report had said. So my initial thing was, as academics, as scholars, our principal job is solving intellectual puzzles. Because I had worked at the intersection of scholarship and international policy, my primary interest was how to solve policy puzzles by bringing to the table the existing state of knowledge from around the world. So it was a very good opportunity for me to look at all that, and that's how I got interested and involved.
So that all makes sense in terms of you're already extremely well versed in these topics. Obviously, I wasn't when the pandemic broke out. I then immediately went looking for experts and people that like yourself that really did know what was going on. And of course, many of them were on the government payroll. They weren't, as you said, retired and unable to be fired when the pandemic started. Many of them were deeply compromised by their own career ambitions or financial circumstances or these sorts of things, and they chose to follow the line. Is that enough to explain why there were so few people that spoke out? I mean, Anders Tegnell, as a health minister in Sweden, was, of course, almost the singular outlier, with the exception of a few states in the US and a handful of other countries that, from the arrogant Anglosphere point of view, aren't really reference countries that we would necessarily look at. But in terms of wealthier developed countries, Anders Tegnell stands almost alone. And in terms of public intellectuals and people with real epidemiological experience and knowledge, we had the likes of Professor Johnny Ioannidis, and we had obviously the Jay Bhattacharya's and a handful of people, but they were very much the exceptions. Surely everyone in your profession, everyone in that profession knew what all the pandemic preparedness plans already said. They understood that science doesn't flip on its head overnight. So in a sense, my question still stands. Was it really just the fact that you were retired that made you able to then speak? What stopped them?
Well, it's more than that. Firstly, just for clarification, Tegnell wasn't the health minister. He was the state epidemiologist. And
Okay.
that's important because, in fact, under the Swedish system, by their constitution, the government is prohibited from interfering with the decisions made by the experts, the bureaucrats.
Okay.
And what Tegnell did, especially when the pressure came on and they started being vilified and demonized in the international media, what he did was he went back and looked at the existing plans. He looked at the existing science, and he couldn't figure out why the other countries had abandoned the existing plans. There was no science, there was no history behind it. So he decided to stay with that. And very early on, he said, look, don't judge us by what's happening this year. Judge us in a year or 2 years. Only then will we know whether we have succeeded or failed. And by now, of course, they've been entirely vindicated. Now, the second thing that happened was too many governments, in the name of following the science in the capital T and capital S with the TM at the end of it, handed over policy development and implementation to the medical officers, the chief medical officers, the chief health officer, the Faucis, Jeremy Farrar, Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty in the UK, Brendan Murphy here, and the chief health officers. And as we know from their record by now, it's absolutely abundantly clear they were pretty hopeless. I mean, the level of incompetence and ignorance when you have a chief health officer of a state saying, contact with a box of pizza can spread the contagion to the whole state, or don't touch the football if it comes over to you from the field, things like that. It's just absurd. And there's lots of examples of that. And by now we know, Fauci has admitted, in the UK, Vallance and Whitty have admitted, for example, that there's absolutely no science behind the 2 meter or 6 foot social distancing. They just made it up. Like the 5 kilometer radius, driving radius in your city. Things were just made up with no science behind them. So we know that now. But they had the power and they imposed censorship. When Jay Bhattacharya and Sunetra Gupta and what's his name from Harvard, Martin Kulldorff, when they wrote their Great Barrington Declaration, Fauci and his boss, Francis Collins, engaged in a deliberate takedown, which was brutal, which was ruthless, described them as fringe epidemiologists. So this is full professors of medicine from Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford. You don't get better credentials than that. What happened as a result was, because of the massive censorship, a lot of which still exists, people did not realize the extent to which there was quite extensive scientific dissent from what became the orthodoxy of the narrative. And then they became scared in terms of research grants, in terms of promotions, in terms of getting a job, in terms of being fired, demonized, vilified, and so on. And there's a great statement from someone who won the Nobel Prize in physics in the 1930s or 40s, long time ago. And he was told why, and he had come from Eastern Europe originally. And he was told, why do you keep contact with people who collaborated with the Nazi regime and are now under communist dictatorships? And he said, it's very easy to be a hero in a democracy. Meaning that once the curtain comes down, most people are not prepared to put their heads over the parapet. I can live with that. I understand that. What concerns me is that all you needed is about 10% of the people within the profession to speak out.
Yeah.
And the whole would have been broken. Yeah. So that complete silence, that lack of courage to stand up, that did surprise me. And then the compliance of the people with these dictatorial edicts surprised me even more. I would not have expected that any more than I'd have expected to see on my TV screens the scenes from Melbourne through all this.
Yeah.
And, I'm glad Mr. Andrews got his AC. I hope he enjoys it.
Well, Daniel Andrews, of course, has just been honoured by the King. Yay, long live the King. Wonderful to see, what is it, a whole bunch of elites standing around handing awards to themselves, handing awards to each other. Wonderful. But you're dead right about the censorship side of things. In fact, last week's podcast that I did, I had a funeral director on the podcast. She was discussing what she was observing, her own observations. She's been a funeral director for a number of decades. She made the comment that she was now observing approximately 4 infant burials a week, where it used to be perhaps 1 a month.
Wow.
And that was an observation that was a statement that she made based on her own observations of the lived experience that she was having as a funeral director. I received a few days ago an email from the Australian Associated Press asking me to provide proof that that statement from her was correct. And of course, proof means I need to provide a study or something along that line. And I've kind of had it up to here with all this kind of nonsense, these fact checkers deciding to get busy. And so I just wrote back and I said, how dare you sit there at your computer thinking that you're just going to do some Googling and fact check someone who is, in their profession, they've been doing it for decades. They're speaking directly to me about what they're observing, and you want to tell me that you're going to call them a liar and brand that as misinformation. So I sent back a rather curt email along that exact line, and so far no action's been taken. The podcast is still online. There isn't a fact check warning on it, and I haven't received a reply. So I'll let you know how that goes.
Well,
but the other thing,
can I just comment on that?
Yeah,
I think the person who wrote to you is just betraying his or her ignorance on how things work. Firstly, it's direct observational data, first-person observational data. So in fact, counts as proof. You can have scientific studies, experimental studies, you can have modeling. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. And the fact that someone who observes this themselves directly in a funeral home should have less credence and credibility than abstract mathematical modeling, whose outcomes depend entirely on assumptions you feed into it, like a certain Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London. That just demonstrates a level of ignorance about how scientific studies are done. Secondly, it's a very crazy world out there, in the sense that if I write an article for an academic journal and I say something about the United Nations based on my own direct experience, the editors will say, we need a citation, we need a footnote as to where you got that from. But if you interview me and I say the same thing, and you publish your article, and you provide the footnote, interview with a former Assistant Secretary General, then it is accepted. So a direct statement for the person concerned is not acceptable, but indirect version of the same statement is acceptable. So it's a crazy world, and you just have
it is a crazy
world. Ignore the
and,
crazy. But there's one other thing I should add to my previous answer, and that is because of my prior involvement with media work and with high quality outlets, including, for example, the Australian here, the Global Mail in Canada, which I didn't get back to, but the Times of India was another one, the Japan Times. I was still able to write and publish articles, and I might have been one of the very few independent commentators, as opposed to the professional journalists, who was still able to do that, and making very clear that I have no medical qualifications. I was speaking as a policy analyst at senior levels, but nonetheless as a policy analyst. And I was analyzing it from a policy point of view, drawing on studies by others, but not have the qualification myself. Yeah. So I think that was also helpful. And that meant that other people then started, at one stage I said, I'm done. This is not my field. I want to get back to my daytime jobs like nuclear issues again, nuclear weapons issues. And they said, no, you seem to have an ability to absorb the scientific studies, and you have access to the media. Please, there's not many voices speaking out. You have a stature, you have some credibility. Continue with that, which meant I had to be careful in terms of my sources as well, because you make one bad mistake and your credibility is short.
Well, you've actually written a book now, a compilation. Actually, no, sorry, put a pin in that. I want to come back to that. The point I wanted to make about censorship is actually based on Steve Riller's comment here. Cafe locked out, and I was just chatting with Michael Gray Griffith today. They have been locked out of one of their accounts for over 3,000 days. And he sent me a screenshot of the little notification that they got. And apparently it's a complete lockout. So Cafe Locked Out has been locked out. They are unable to do anything with their page. They cannot post anything. They cannot provide any information. They cannot like or interact. I doubt that they'd be able to even respond to messages or anything like that for the princely sum of over 10 years. And I have that not just from Steve. Steve, thank you for reminding me of it, but I do have that directly from Michael Grey-Griffith himself. It's an extraordinary thing, the amount of power that we're seeing social media companies have. And they're being censored essentially because they've given a platform to people who are the primary sources. They've given a platform to people who are talking about their own vaccine injuries, to medical people that are talking about their own observations and what they're seeing, to school teachers and principals that are talking about their own observations of the impact of lockdowns on students, etc. So they are, you're quite right to pull me up and make the point that actually someone talking about their own observed experience in their own field of expertise, that is evidence in its own right. And their crime, for which they've now been censored off social media for 10 years, is that they were giving a platform for people to provide that.
So if I say that a doctor told me such and such happened in his or her clinic, that's hearsay. But if the doctor himself or herself speaks to you directly, that's direct evidence. That's observational data. Evidence. That's perfectly legitimate.
So it's an extraordinary amount of power that we're seeing. And we just saw a showdown between the e-safety commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, and Twitter owner Elon Musk over the Billboard Chris. The Billboard Chris posts were a different side of it, over the stabbing of Bishop Marmari in Sydney, and the video of that stabbing. And it seems as though the e-safety commissioner has had to back down, at least in the form of the legal side of it. It seems that there's still an
in the courts.
Administrative
She
process.
says she's going to appeal in the administrative tribunal.
Yeah. What do we do about situations like this? You've been inside the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
You were talking before about getting your G20s and things together to be able to sort of form accords and make decisions and then go back to their respective bureaucracies to implement policies. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of that idea. We saw things like the National Cabinet implemented here in Australia during COVID, which I would argue, and please disagree if you disagree, but I would argue is based on the same principle. Get the heads of state together in a room, they make decisions and then go back to their respective states to implement that through their bureaucracies. I'm not convinced at all that we see a better quality of decision making. How do we deal with this problem of elites and heads of state and UN intergovernmental bodies making and then just implementing these decisions seemingly without any real democratic recourse on the part of the public?
There's, I think that itself could keep us going for 5 hours, but we won't. Let me unpack that, because there are several threads in that that I entangled, intertwined very badly. Firstly, where you started off, add to that the whole debanking scandal in the UK, particularly of Nigel Farage, which got all the publicity, but others as well, including on these issues, Toby Young, who founded the Daily Skeptic. What used to be
the Canadian truckers as well, they were debanked, and anyone that helped to fund them.
And what that shows is the danger of over-digitization. So as individuals, one of the things I have been doing consciously since all this broke is minimizing my use of credit cards and using cash.
Sure.
It will keep the regional branches open longer. It will keep more people in jobs. It takes away total control that they would otherwise have. So that's something that we can do as individuals. I have always resisted self-checkout counters, and I'm glad that there is a backlash to that as well, partly because even though it's not important for me, for a lot of elderly people, quite often, it's the only human interaction they get during the week is with the counter, with the people at the counter, and they talk to them and they take time, and it can be irritating if you're waiting in the line, but we are prepared to pay that price. So that's one thing. Second, I think your good people break bad laws. I think we all have to be active in resisting granting any additional power to governments. If a power is expanded and extended, the scope for abuse increases. And if a power can be abused, it will be abused someday by someone somewhere, not necessarily by those who pass the laws, but by someone at some future date. They will be abused. And once a power is given to politicians, surprise, surprise, they are extremely reluctant ever to give it back to the people. And they certainly won't give it all back. So I think we have to resist that. And that's where many of the ongoing efforts today come in, including the power grab by the WHO in terms of amended international health regulations and the attempt to get a new treaty through, which has been deferred because it didn't get through this year. Thank God for that. So that's something. And that's where I think we have to oppose the new digital online content laws that the government is proposing. We've seen how easy it would be for the e-safety commissioner to abuse that in terms of personal whims, and the idea that one bureaucrat, an import in this case from the United States, should have the power to decide what we can see and what we can't. I just find absolutely appalling. And yet it was the coalition government that introduced that bill. And Peter Dutton is on record in praising the e-safety commissioner. I think as Alexander Marshall says, you elect a policeman, you get a police state, or at least you risk getting a police state. So I think we need to be careful of all that. And then fight class action suits, publicize these things, and find alternative means. Put companies that engage in this on your blacklist in turn. Their business model is having a large customer base. If we start pulling our accounts out now, rather than waiting until we individually are frozen, then they will feel the pinch. Look at the alternative TV podcast channels that sprang up in reaction to YouTube starting to engage in censorship. Rumble, BitChute, all sorts of other things. And the alternative media now, some of it may be fringe, but a lot of them have more sizable audiences and a lot more credibility than the mainstream media. The reputation in the mainstream media has just plummeted all around the world for very good reason. So I think the notion that we are helpless is not true. We just need to get active, and we need to start resisting, and we need to start organizing and doing all this, both at the individual level and at the group level. We are past the stage where we should put up with it. And in that sense, I think one of the most heartening things in very recent times has been the European parliamentary elections. It is the revolt of the masses against the elites. That's the only way I can describe it. And we have the rise of essentially a new right across Europe. I think Sir Keir Starmer is likely to be elected with a landslide in the UK. But one reason for that will be the threat, the disruption brought in by Nigel Farage, again from the new right. I think as things stand, it's likely that Trump may be president again in January next year. I think that the coalition would have better chances of winning even next year, if the elections are held next year, if they actually embrace what's called populist causes, using the word populist pejoratively. But in fact, what it means is parties are responding to the popular will. Populism means they have their policy preferences, they have their own cultural values, they don't accept many of the dominant themes with regard to net zero and mass immigration and gender and racial identity. And they feel disrespected and disregarded and ignored by the major political parties. So any minor party that responds to their concerns is likely to attract a lot of attention. I don't know if you saw, yesterday there was an astounding poll from somewhere in the UK, which showed that 46% of all voters and 24% of Conservative voters from 2019 are rooting for the Conservatives to have exactly 0 seats. That's the depth of white-hot rage against the perception of betrayal after 14 years of Conservative rule and tacking to the center.
What we call conservative parties have ceased to be conservative quite some time ago. But I think if they want to see their future...
We have a world of uniparties in Europe, in the UK, in America, in Australia. Differences, UK, well, we've seen the differences in Europe now. We have the different situation in Canada. And guess what? Someone who stands up for traditional conservative principles is smashing Trudeau in the polls.
Yeah.
So there is a lesson in all that.
Yeah, well, but that's exactly it. And the future of Conservative parties, if they don't learn that lesson, is visible in Victoria. Have a look at the state
There
of
is no
Victoria.
future.
Well, there is no future. That's exactly right. You know, the Liberal
They
Party of
continue to live in
Victoria
the
is
past glory.
actively punishing its own members, including its own elected members, if they have principles. And it is only promoting and allowing to progress in their careers their members that are willing to compromise those principles.
In the now clearly mistaken belief that these voters have nowhere else to go. Well, guess what? You're leaving conservative values, they're leaving your party.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're dead right. And we're seeing that across Europe, which is very, very encouraging. I find the situation in the US absolutely fascinating. I tend to agree that I believe that Trump will win and that the margin will be such that they're not able to fudge it. I just wonder whether they'll be holding the inauguration at Guantanamo Bay.
Possibly.
It's an extraordinary situation, and we just saw the conviction of Hunter Biden on his gun charges. Now, what's interesting, people are trying to draw equivalence between Trump and Hunter. And I don't actually think there is an equivalence there, because Hunter's crimes that he's now been found guilty of are crimes that apply to everybody. They apply to the masses. That is an example of the rule of law, where the law is being equally applied to people, whether they have powerful
Well,
connections.
yes and no. Yes and no. Even there, they worked out a sweetheart deal that was so bad that the judge rejected it. It's only then that they actually charged him. And another C was charged. They allowed the clock to run out on statute of limitations. Whereas with Trump, they brought in a new law to invalidate the statute of limitations. So there's all sorts of differences. Hunter was tried in his home state, in Delaware. Trump was tried in the most Republican hostile district in the whole country. So there's all sorts of differences. And the direct comparison is in terms of the documents, unauthorized documents being stored at home, is between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So the most serious charges might still come for Hunter Biden. And in the meantime, though, nonetheless, this whole phrase, Trump is a convicted felon, has been taken off the political campaign issue.
But it's extraordinary to me that the people trying to convict Trump actually thought that was going to work out in their favor. It seemed obvious to me, and I called this publicly, I'm on the public record calling this, that this was a lose-lose strategy at the time when they launched this. If Trump wins the court case, Trump wins. If Trump loses the court case, Trump wins. And we've seen that in his popularity rising. It's fascinating to see the more they try and marginalize him, the more marginalized people in America identify with him. We're seeing him surging in amongst minorities, amongst immigrants, amongst Black people, amongst traditionally Democrat voting blocs.
I think, Topher, it goes back to something you said earlier, and that is the divide between the elites and the, shall we say, deplorables. The elites are the scolds and the sneers who look down upon the attitudes and the values and belief systems of the ordinary people. But as a result, firstly, they live in their own echo chamber and the thought bubbles, and they have lost all connection with the real world. Secondly, they are so full of self-righteous superiority that they don't realize that their attitude is actually getting the backs of more and more people. Look at the way that Albanese and company conducted the voice referendum debate. Once they started branding all opponents as racists and bigots and what have you, that they lost it. If they had engaged with the opposition and the points that were being raised of legitimate concern, they might still have succeeded, especially if they moderated some of the more extreme parts of that, what they were trying to do. But the way they treated the people just made the people say, well, okay, you're not interested in talking, we won't talk to you either, we'll just vote. And that's what happened with the deplorables comment originally from Hillary Clinton with Trump. And it goes back to the populists. The leaders are tapping into real, deeply held convictions and deeply felt anger. And this feeds into the anger. By the way, most Australians will not be aware of it, but we had something very similar happen just last week in India.
Okay.
Prime Minister Modi looked across at Canada, looked across at the example of freezing the financial accounts of the truckers. And you know what? The main opposition party, the Congress party, it had its bank accounts frozen in the middle of the election campaign.
Wow.
Modi looked across at the weaponization of the criminal justice system in the US, and two incumbent state chief ministers, the equivalent of premiers in Australia, they were arrested in the middle of the campaign. And then they started talking about the alliance has 350 seats in the present parliament. Our goal is to increase that to 400 seats. And one of them made the mistake of speculating publicly that will allow us to change the constitution, and then we can do what we want. And the people reacted. Essentially, I've done an article saying that the voters' verdict on Modi is keep going, but under caution. They didn't want to throw him out. He hadn't been that bad, but they sure were not going to give him an increased majority. So it is happening all over the world. They think they're so superior, and their contempt for the people is so deep that they don't realize what their actions consequences are, and how what they're doing is perceived by the people, and they revolt against it. So the fact that people are seeing through it, I would add that I think all the COVID policies, in the end, deepened the distrust of government, of media, of big corporate firms, and the big financial firms. And people can see the collusion, and they're starting to say, no, we don't want that sort of world in the future. We are going to do our best to resist it. So I agree with you, but I think it's actually a worldwide phenomenon. And the reason they don't see it is they're too full of themselves.
Well, I want to drill down a bit deeper, and you're a great person to have this conversation. This is a conversation I've wanted to have with for quite some time, but there's very few people that really actually have the real world experience that you've got to be able to comment on this. You've worked inside the UN. One of the big things that I come up against a lot in what I do is people who want to believe or believe, whether they want to or not, that everyone at the UN, in the government, etc., must be evil. That these must be evil people. That they're all somehow co-conspirators in some kind of an evil plot. Can you give us some color and give us some depth? I'm not saying that what they're doing isn't evil, but people can be doing things that work out to be evil without actually intending it. And there can be a lot more subtlety in the people that you deal with. So can you paint a bit of a picture for us, the high level, the worker bees at the lower levels of these organizations? What motivates these people, and how should someone like me, who is trying to essentially speak out against what they're doing, what's a constructive way to do that doesn't alienate?
Okay, sure. I think to brand all international civil servants, or even all national and state level civil servants, as evil, A, is factually wrong, and B, in practice, is counterproductive. It's a wrong tactic to use, even if it was true, but it's not true.
Sure.
Second, the United Nations is several things at once. Firstly, it's an international bureaucracy. And an international bureaucracy has the pathologies of all national bureaucracies multiplied 193 times, because there's 193 member states. Because they're not underpinned by a common culture, a common language, a common legal framework, a common constitutional framework, etc., etc. So it's actually much worse at the international level. And there are pathologies of the individual parts of the UN system. The United Nations is not one single entity. It's a collection of a number of different entities. And the WHO is essentially autonomous, for example. The Director General is not appointed by the Secretary General. He's elected by the World Health Assembly, which is a member state of the WHO, so on and so forth. And similarly, a lot of the top appointments in the UN system, some are by the Secretary General, many are by their own boards, and some is a mixture of the two. The Secretary General himself is appointed essentially by the Security Council, where the biggest say is exercised by the 5 permanent members. 3 of the 5 permanent members are Western, not communist, not developing country, and that's US, UK, and France. So we have to remember that the Western countries have had far more of a dominating influence in the UN system than any other group.
To be clear, though, I don't particularly trust the Western countries in the
No,
first place, so that doesn't necessarily comfort me.
If you read the public comments, it's all the other countries creating the problems. In fact, a lot of the problems have come from Western governments. Where do you think gender identity came from? Which have been the countries pushing the new WHO treaty the most? The United States and Germany. Possibly because some of the big pharmaceutical companies are hosted by the United States and Germany. So we tend to point the finger of blame at China. I think we need to be a bit more accurate in that. So that's one thing. Then, in addition to all that, the United Nations is also an idea. And a lot of support for it internationally, including Western countries, comes in terms of what it represents. It represents a world that's not separated by religion, nationality, gender, etc. It's one human family. It's the only body in the whole world that houses the divided fragments of humanity. Look what happened after the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004. The response of the peoples to a genuine humanitarian tragedy was spontaneous, it was massive, and we as people shamed our governments into responding more generously than they had initially. So that sense of solidarity across borders is symbolized by and comes together in practice at the United Nations. That's what draws maximum support. It represents an ideal that we are simply not prepared to give up, of a human family connected more than divided. And that's something that we shouldn't give up. The maximum number of civil servants who work for the United Nations do so because of that idealism. And if they come in at an entry-level position and then they encounter the politics at the top level, they very quickly become disillusioned and cynical and either leave if they can find jobs elsewhere or become time servers if they lack the qualifications and experience. But that is a lot due to our things. And I've had a lot of discussions with member governments who all want changes, but don't want to give power to the UN at the cost of the UN taking action against them.
Yeah.
And, the All for Food scandal, you may remember, the Kofi's announced time. Australians were complicit in that. The UN officials raised the alarm and the Australian government said, that's all right, nothing to worry about, sort of thing. So there is that duality there. And finally, the policies of the United Nations are set not by the United Nations as such, but by member states.
Sure.
The member states are the principals. The United Nations is the agent. And they can propose, but the governments decide, and then the international bureaucracy implements that. So I think we need to be careful. There are parts of the UN system that still work. There are parts that are ossified, both in the bureaucracy and in the political organs, and parts that have lost the original mission, and there's been mission creep and perversion and subversion, not the least because a lot of the money now, funding, comes from specified programs, particularly for the WHO. More than 80% of its funding is what's called specified funding, some of it from private sector partnerships, including the Gates Foundation, principally, but a lot from the Western governments. And specified means we'll give it to you for this program and this activity, and if that's not acceptable, we won't give you the money. So it's not necessarily the WHO officials, but the governments that are still controlling the agenda.
For those who are potentially new to this topic, explain why specified funding is a bad thing.
If you give me a core budget, if I'm in charge of a particular entity, then I can decide to allocate the resources and choose personnel and fill positions on the basis of priorities that I see for my organization.
Okay.
But if 80% of my money comes under specified things and you tell me what the money is to be spent on, then I'm no longer in control of my agenda. I have the responsibility, but no longer the authority and freedom to do that. I'll give you one specific example.
Sure.
I wrote Kofi Annan's second reform report in 2002. One of the things we asked for under the UN system, you have the ranks go from P2 to P5, then it becomes D1, D2, then it becomes assistant and under secretary general, and then you have the SG. Okay. The relevant committee of the General Assembly, which has the financial power, would specify how many posts at which level in which department for the secretariat in New York itself. And it's a 2-year perspective in the future budget. It's a set for the next 2 years. A lot can happen within the 2 years. So what we said is, can you give me, I was writing in the name of the Secretary General, can you give me, the Secretary General, the freedom to stay within your overall budget limits, but reallocate positions and ranks from one department to another based on my judgment of what the need is if things have changed, which seems a very sensible and necessary thing to do. They said, no. We will tell you which position, how many at which rank, and that will stay firm and constant. If it needs changing, you come back to us.
That's fairly typical of large bureaucracies, though. Bureaucracy tends to breed bureaucracy, and they tend to want to complicate things.
Our parliament doesn't set the number of posts and the rank at which each department will, look at the way the advisors have multiplied.
Yeah.
So think of the speechwriters that Bill Shorten has hired.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. You're not going to have the, I'm not going to defend
it was micromanaging. It was micromanaging by a General Assembly committee at a level that was absurd. And I remember when the UNDP administrator, who was the third highest rank in the UN system at the time, you have the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, and the UNDP administrator. The UNDP administrator, now Sir Mark Malloch Brown, was brought in as the number 2 Deputy Secretary General. And he said he hadn't realized until he stepped in as Kofi's deputy that as UNDP head, he had more discretion and flexibility than the Secretary General had, who was his boss.
Yeah, right. Yeah, wow. So I think your assessment is correct. I mean, listening to the ideals of what the UN should be about, I can get behind those ideals for as long as they remain voluntary. I'm a libertarian, and so voluntary association I've got no problem with. Voluntary unionism, voluntary political party membership, voluntary UN membership, etc.
So the challenge is to find the sweet spot between national autonomy and international cooperation. You can over-centralize nationally, which we have done in all democracies. It's been over-centralized in the federal system and within the federal government in the office of the Prime Minister, where Prime Ministers have become more presidential. And we have seen over-centralization at the international level as well. So I think we need to put things back at the level where they're best handled, from the local through the national, to the state, and the national to the international.
So 100% on board with that concept. Subsidiarity, I think, is one of the words that gets used to refer to this. Basically, bringing decisions down to the lowest sort of practicable level where those decisions can be made. In practice, how do we actually get the UN to even allow that to happen, to agree to that? Or do we need to get them to allow it? Is that something we can do unilaterally?
That's where we work through our governments. The UN doesn't make the decision. It's governments, member states, to do that. So we need to put pressure on our governments. So if we wanted to reject the WHO treaty, we put pressure on our government to say, speak out, not just vote against, but speak out against it. Instead, we had our minister there saying, we support, we strongly demand legally binding agreements. Well, maybe we should look at how the WHO performed. Maybe we should look at the empirical basis on the basis of which they are justifying their claims, which simply don't stand up, which is one of the things we said in Melbourne at that international press conference that you attended. So, and we didn't do that. We just took it for granted.
So this is one of the things that I think a lot of people don't know, and to be honest, I didn't fully comprehend until probably only about 18 months ago. We have this perception, and I think the UN and the media and the government actually like to perpetuate this perception, that the UN makes decisions that are binding and enforceable on Australia. As a general rule, though, that's not the case. When we send someone over there to sign an accord or sign an agreement, that accord or agreement in its own right doesn't have any legal authority here. It then has to be It's our politicians coming back here and passing local legislation.
There's two steps. One is we are part of the body that votes yes or no to that agreement. And if the majority of countries vote for the amendment to the international health regulations, as an individual country, we still have the right, legal right, to opt out of that. And we have up X number of months from that date to do that. If we don't, then by default, we are considered from that point on to be bound legally by that. But that can only be given effect by implementing legislation domestically as well in any case. Hence the two steps.
Right.
So we actually can opt out. And for the amendments to be passed, because it's an existing treaty, we needed 50% vote at the World Health Assembly. For a new treaty, they would need 2/3 vote, and then the treaty would need to be ratified by every member country as well. So
Right.
yes, there are safeguards built in. It's very easy for us to pass the buck, say it was the UN that decided, but that's because we don't want to take the responsibility for that. It's very easy to say, and once it is approved, we'll say, well, we wouldn't want to do it, but if we don't do it, it's breaking international law, and we don't want to do that. So we pass the buck to the WHO, and we scapegoat. In fact, Kofi Annan used to joke. We in the system, we used to refer to him as, we called him SG, just like we say PM. We'd say SG, and he said, there are more times that I think SG stands for scapegoat than anything else.
Politicians passing the buck. Who knew? Who knew that they wouldn't want to take responsibility?
Especially our present politicians.
Oh gosh. Now, I meant to talk about your book earlier and then moved on to another topic. I want to come back to it. So I recently read your book. It is called Our Enemy, the Government. I thought that the name of my book, Good People Break Bad Laws, was pretty confrontational. But you've one-upped me. Our Enemy, the Government. Tell us a little bit about, so this is essentially a thematically arranged compilation of a lot of your publications that were published in anywhere from Spectator to Brownstone to I think somewhere from the Australian and various places. It's quite an astonishing kind of real-time record of your work. And I'll congratulate you again. I said at the outset, but I'll congratulate you again on being one of the earliest, and I believe one of the most prolific throughout that madness to actually be speaking out and consistently on the right side of history across all those issues. Tell me a little bit about that journey. You said earlier that you were able to keep publishing, which is in itself a pretty extraordinary thing. What was some of the pushback and the blowback that you received, if any, and why did you then choose to turn it into a book?
Just to be clear, I didn't get too much of a pushback and blowback. I mean, there were inevitably criticisms, but they were few and far between. I got a lot more support than blowback, and it helped that I was never on social media. I'm very glad that I was never on social media for that. So that was important and helpful. But again, the title comes from an interesting paradox that people don't realize. I've been a long-term champion of human rights and liberal democratic governance, okay? And we promoted that in the UN system. In fact, one of the great successes of the UN system since existence in 1945 has been universalizing the human rights norm. The UN is hopeless at monitoring and enforcing, particularly against powerful countries. But in terms of promoting standards as a standard-setting organization in human rights, it has an unmatched record in that sense. And that's been one of the great successes. So even though states might violate the norms, they are very reluctant to criticize the norms themselves publicly, as opposed to violating in practice. And from that point of view, when the government brings in lockdowns, well, that's a euphemism. What does it mean? It means you're putting me individually and you're putting all Australians population-wide under house arrest. Now, if I have not committed a crime and I'm not sick, on what authority are you putting me under house arrest? Why should I obey you? Now, you got the book with your title, Good People Break Laws. I come from a country that achieved independence on the back of a freedom struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi, who followed that prescription very much in practice. That is not just our right to break laws if our laws are bad, it is our duty to break laws that are bad. And he was very polite. He eschewed violence. He believed strongly in non-violence, both as the level of principle and in terms of its effects.
I believe the
it was
expression that I quote in the book of his, I believe, was non-violent non-compliance. That's sort of the English translation of his sort of two-word summary of what it was that he practiced.
And he was always very respectful and courteous and polite towards his judges. And he said, you do your duty, I've done my duty. My duty is a matter of my conscience. Yours is a matter of your oath of office. And that was very effective. So now, secondly, what is human rights? Leaving aside the philosophical definitions, you have a paradox there, a central paradox. The worst violations of human rights occur in conditions of anarchy where there is no government. And we've seen that in failed countries and failed societies. And we worked against that in the UN system to strengthen state societies. Once you have a stable, functioning, effective government, you can then put in place a framework of human rights legislation and monitoring and enforcement of machinery. And the state then can guarantee human rights. But at the same time, once you have a powerful state, the state itself becomes the biggest threat to human rights in terms of individual civil liberties and political freedoms. And that paradox and tension exists in all countries. And what we have seen since the end of the Second World War, which was a triumph of democratic and human rights over the Nazi efforts, challenge to it. What we have seen since then is firstly the rise of the national security state during the Cold War, when a lot of individual liberties were stripped from us in the name of combating this evil menace from the communist Soviet Union and China. Then we had the rise of the administrative state, where more and more legislative powers were delegated to the administrative state, and the judiciary deferred to the expertise of the administrators. And therefore, the bureaucrats acquired more and more delegated legislative and quasi-judicial powers. Then we had the rise of the surveillance state, where the state acquired incredibly powerful means of putting us all under surveillance and monitoring.
This is particularly post 9/11.
Post 9/11, as revealed by Julian Assange and Edward Snowden in particular. And then in the COVID era, we saw the rise of the biosecurity state, where we were treated effectively as guilty until proven to be uninfected, where we are treated as disease-carrying biohazards, as germ-ridden carriers of disease, and had to be kept in isolation and under quarantine and so on. And to do that, the state acquired more and more power. So the subtitle of the book is How COVID Was Used and Abused to Expand State Power. How COVID enabled the expansion and abuse of state power. And that's what the book tries to deal with, that under the guise of fighting a pandemic, the state expanded its powers enormously at the expense of political freedoms and individual liberties, and engaged in a level of brutal enforcement, not just without precedent, but that would have been unimaginable in January 2020. How many Australians would have believed that they would be seeing these scenes in Sydney and in Melbourne and on the border of Queensland and New South Wales? Queensland hospitals are for Queenslanders. And a baby expected, one of the twins dies caught in that bureaucratic nightmare. So it was a descent into primitivism that was shocking. And we support. And for me, the image remains of Zoe Bula, the pregnant mom in Ballarat, who was arrested around breakfast time.
So I want to go somewhere uncomfortable, and this is another one of those topics that there just aren't many people I can actually ask this question to. But given your intimate knowledge of Indian history, the role of Gandhi in winning independence for India from British rule, one of the things that I've reflected on is what I did in Victoria, and obviously joined by many others. It wasn't me alone, but what we did in Victoria was only really possible because there was at least a remnant of the rule of law. There was at least a remnant of conscience. I would argue, and please disagree if you need to, but I would argue that what Gandhi did was really made possible, yes, by his courage and those with him, etc., but also by the fact that there was still a conscience within the British rule and within the British army, at least to some degree, that he was able to appeal to through his non-violent means. I would argue that probably wouldn't have worked if India had been colonized, for example, by communist Russia. Methods like what I used on the streets of Melbourne wouldn't necessarily have worked on the streets of Venezuela against the socialist dictatorship there. Is there a relationship between civil disobedience and this idea of what we saw Gandhi modeling? Is there a point where a regime simply is too far gone? I guess I'm not even sure what I'm asking in a sense.
I think, no, I know what you're getting at. I think there's a lot of academic research which would say that once you take resort to violence, it becomes much easier for the state to delegitimize you.
Sure.
And once the state has delegitimized you, it is easier for the state in turn to use brutal force. And if they have succeeded in delegitimizing you, then it's harder for you to garner public support behind your protest and your revolt, which is why it was important for them to demonize those who were protesting as putting everyone else at risk, as being selfish, as being granny killers, etc., etc. So those things are there. Now, that doesn't mean, but the premise of your question is correct. It is not necessarily the case that a tactic that has succeeded in one context against one political opponent will automatically succeed against another. So you have to adapt them. But the basic premise is correct that non-violence is more effective, whether it is civil disobedience, work to rule. People like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, people like Václav Havel in what was Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
I don't think we should underestimate the element of basic human decency that is common to all cultures and civilizations. Ordinary people have a much stronger sense of what's right and what's wrong than the sophisticated elites, I think. And you have to appeal to that. And it will take courage. It will mean that some of us may have to be prepared to accept a very heavy cost, including threats to life or liberty and freedom. But that's why we have many awards given to the true heroes, as opposed to the perpetrators of public crimes.
As opposed to the King's Birthday Awards. No, it is an interesting area, and I broadly agree with you, but I feel as though there's a piece of the puzzle that I haven't yet managed to get my head around, and I may not for some years yet. Even someone like an Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who you mentioned, he talked in, I think, the Gulag Archipelago, I think it was, where he talks about how we burned later in the camps, and talked about how if only we'd all set up an ambush in the foyer of our apartment buildings when the organs of state came to drag people away, and we'd fought them with pokers and shovels and whatever we could get, then that whole evil sort of industry of people knocking down doors and dragging people away would have ground to a halt. They would have run out of men and machines. And so even he, as someone who had practiced nonviolence, was later essentially admitting to a retrospective regret, a retrospective recognition that perhaps actually they should have crossed that line and gone into an active form of rebellion in those particular circumstances. However, I would also immediately follow that by saying, it will almost always be a mistake to cross that line. I think history shows us that there are occasions where that line ought to be crossed, but for every time where that's true, there's thousands of people around the world who cross that line, and it was not true. It was not the right time.
Well,
And that
okay, let me go back to what I was saying. I think we have to distinguish between active resistance against agents of the state and randomized indiscriminate violence.
agreed.
That's the distinction.
Yeah.
So, of course, you can resist being arrested when you're taking
Right.
part in those protests, and you can have a group of people who surround you and then lie down and make it difficult for the cops to arrest you, other than stepping over them in turn. And you can have someone else taking film of that and broadcasting it to the world, which is impossible to control these days. So, but think of the brave women in Iran protesting against compulsory hijab wearing. If they engage in violence, and particularly randomized violence, it is much easier for the government to suppress them
100%.
and take care of that.
100%.
If, on the other hand, they have colleagues taking, or even innocent bystanders, strangers, taking video and smuggling that out, just as the Samizdat tradition from the Soviet Union. Where was the Gulag published first? You smuggle that out and get international support, mobilize international support. So I think it's you adapt it to the circumstances. You should resist the state. You should use all avenues open to you legally and through international collaboration. But once you cross the line into violence, your chances of hurting your cause rather than advancing it, I think, begin to increase exponentially. So I'm very reluctant to go down the violence route for that reason. Now, that's different from interstate warfare. Let's not confuse that with pacifism. In terms of state versus state.
Look, I agree, and I deal quite in some detail for about a half a chapter of my book in the simple fact that how you go about civil disobedience is.
I've read your book. It's a good read. I encourage everyone to read it.
Yeah. Now I want to. We've probably got about 10 minutes left or so. One of the I'm ticking off all the topics that I've wanted to talk to someone about and not had the right person. There's one more topic that I've had on my mind, and that is to talk about the future of India. India, in my mind, is going to become, I mean, it already is in many respects, but it will become even more so, one of the most significant countries and cultures on the face of the planet going forward. Its significance is only going to increase. I think that Australia, at a political level, at a cultural level, pays more attention to China than we probably should, and less attention to India than we probably should, not in the sense of it being a threat, but in the sense of it being an opportunity. How do you see the growth, the future of India? Historically, again, this is just my opinion, India appears to me to have been a relatively non-violent country. They're not known for initiating wars, for expansionism, these sorts of things. They have, to a more or less functional degree, democratic norms, and it could be argued how well is that functioning right now. But nevertheless, there is certainly an aspiration towards that, and there is a framework in place that at least has some appearance of that. They're a country that we can trade with, and they're a country that a handful of idiots notwithstanding, we can get along with very, very well. What do you see as the future of India? Is it an opportunity? Is the West paying enough attention? And what could we do to I guess, better take advantage of where the world is heading?
I think it's a mistake to posit India as a counterpoint to China. I think there are good reasons why we have extended broad relations with China, and I think we should stay with that without forgetting the potential for strategic rivalry and conflict. So I think we need to watch the relationship with China, but not cut back on it if things work out well. So there's no reason to pull back. I don't think we need to be uncritical and unquestioning camp followers of anyone else, but there are good reasons from our own point of view why we need to be wary of what China is doing, for example, in the South China Sea. There are good reasons for us from our own point of view why we need to maintain good relations with Taiwan and with Japan and with others.
Yeah.
The advantage compared to China that India has is there's virtually no baggage to consolidating relations with India. There are no downsides, there are many upsides.
Yep.
I have always argued, now, the fact that India remains a functioning, in a very real sense, democracy is a great testament and tribute to the country. It's one of the very few countries that came out of independence that has maintained that trajectory. India remaining democratic and broadly liberal democratic is actually far more important to the world than the United States being that. So the elections in India this year, for most of the world, is more consequential than the elections in the US. Not for us in Australia necessarily, but for most of the world. I have always argued that there are three great institutions that explain the survival and stability and now prosperity of India. One is democracy, second is federalism, third is secularism. Every country likes to think of itself as diverse and complex. Well, there is no country in the world that is more diverse and more complex and more challenging to govern than India. It has managed to achieve that great challenge of unity in diversity. I think Modi had fallen victim to an element of hubris and arrogance and engaged in excesses. Last year, I wrote an article saying I still put my faith in the self-correcting mechanisms of democracy, including India. And we've seen that play out this year. I think he's been reined in by the people because they didn't like the excesses. And they've now put constraints around him where he doesn't have a majority in his own right anymore, by the way. You needed 272 seats in the parliament for a majority. He's got 240. The alliance altogether is 286, but that's got a few other parties. So it's not even just one other party. And that will put brakes on his excesses. It will force him into a more consensual style. The price of that is more apparent instability and volatility and slower pace of reforms and change. But then you at least get to carry the people with you. Yeah. And I think that's something we can build on. I think if India gets it right, and it has mostly been getting it right with some setbacks and backsliding, but if India gets it right, most of the growth and most of the growth of the middle class in the world will come in India and from India. That's where most of the growth opportunities will come. And we have great historical advantages in consolidating relations with India. We do that through the Quad. We do that through bilateral trade. We do that through a number of avenues. I think our governments from both sides of the divide have acknowledged the importance of India and have tried to build on it. I think there is lesser understanding at the public level than there is at the official level. And it goes back to an earlier comment about, even the bureaucrats do try to do their best under the circumstances of the time. And that's true across the bureaucracy. There is a desire to deepen and consolidate relations. We have, in recent years, again, with both governments, upped the level of our ambassadorial relations with India in terms of the seniority of ambassadors that we have appointed for that. That will continue. I think Indians now make up the largest single number of migrant group from anywhere in the world. I think that is true. Indians have overtaken even China. So I think there's very few downsides. As I said, there's a lot of upsides. We work together in the Quad with the United States and Japan. I think we have to recognize that the Quad is a diplomatic grouping centered on the maritime Indo-Pacific area for collaboration and dialogue. Its origins go back, by the way, to the tsunami that I mentioned. In the immediate aftermath of the tsunami, there were only 4 navies that were capable of handling the humanitarian scale of the disaster relief operations at the time. It was these 4 countries.
I didn't know that.
And the experience of working together opened their minds to the possibility of institutionalizing that. And that's where it originally comes from. I think we should resist giving it an anti-China bent. And in that sense, India is one of the few, and certainly the only major Asian country outside of Japan that is an ally, that expressed understanding of the AUKUS agreement, for example, and the AUKUS submarines as well. So India doesn't have a tradition of formal military alliances. I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. Stay with the Quad, recognize India's limitations and work within that, and try to refrain from criticizing India publicly. You criticize them, it's a very sensitive government, it will be counterproductive. Just like criticizing the Australian government by a foreign government. That's our backs up. Express your concerns confidentially, that's fine, that's open to that. And they recognize that it's a very complex country and they have to move slowly, but be patient. The rewards will come, but I think, and use people-to-people contacts, because people can get into the interstices of the relationship in a way that governments cannot, and they're much more effective. So, if you have incidents against students in Melbourne, for example, people will believe me when I tell them, don't worry about it, it's minor, it's episodic rather than systemic, whereas they'll expect the government to say that. So I think we should do that.
Media, of course, just like to blow things out of proportion for eyeballs. But last question, I've thoroughly enjoyed this chat, but Jason's asked a really good question here. He says, missed the start, but very interested in the decision that you made to leave the UN. How did that come about? I mean, where do you kind of go in your career, having been the Assistant Secretary General of the UN? What's the next step? Like, do you have to become the Grand Poobah of the Illuminati after that? Like, what's a promotion once you've already been there?
Well, I've enjoyed my post-UN professional career as well. As while I was with the UN, I was involved in that G20 initiative that I told you about.
Sure.
And then I joined the group after leaving the UN. I went and joined the University of Waterloo and the Center for International Governance Innovation, where we had that group located as a hub, if you like. And I was a founding director of a new Balsillie School of International Affairs. And then Gareth Evans brought me back to the ANU to start up a new Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, where we again challenged the prevailing narrative that nuclear weapons are actually useful for maintaining peace via policies of deterrence. And we said, well, not necessarily, but in the meantime, there is a real risk, small, but the consequence would be very bad if nuclear weapons were ever used again, either by design or by accident. So we need to start bringing numbers down and putting in place mechanisms and procedures to handle the crisis, including the nuclear safety side. So I've enjoyed my time. As you said, we've also did, again with Gareth, I did the principle of the responsibility to protect, which was designed to provide protection to victims of mass atrocities, either because governments were not capable of protecting them, or sometimes governments were complicit actively or behind the scenes in the atrocities. So yes, I've had a privileged career. I'm proud of some things we did. I'm pleased I was able to engage in the public debate in terms of trying to curb COVID policy excesses. I think gradually, but a lot more slowly than I care to, people are waking up to that. For me, the unfinished agenda remains holding those who are guilty of these excesses to criminal account. I think that's needed because our sense of justice will not be satisfied until that is done. It may not be in the next year, it may not be even in the next 5 years, but it will come. It will be necessary in order to bring emotional closure to the victims and the families of the victims, whether it's vaccine injured, or whether it's people who lost jobs, or the deaths of despair from loneliness, or whatever. And finally, and most importantly, that accountability is necessary because it's the only effective deterrent against future repetitions. Without that, people will do it all over again.
If we don't seek justice for what was done to us, we condemn our children to have it happen to them. I think that's a really, really, really important point. Look, thank you so much. And I agree with this comment here by Claire, just saying, appreciate the wisdom expressed throughout this interview. I'm sure she's referring to you, Ramesh, not to me. James says,
don't be so modest. Don't be so modest.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. And there's lots of other lots of other great comments coming in. So thank you everyone that's been watching. Ramesh, you're not on social media. How do people follow you if they want to follow your work? Is Brownstone Institute the best place to do that? And how would someone find your book?
Well, that's probably the best place in terms of my current output of writings, because even if it's not originally published there, most of the things I get republished. And I continue to write for the other papers, but on these issues, as I said, I try to get it republished even with Brownstone. They've been very good to me. And they're a very good institution. A lot of other very good people who write for them.
And they were very good during COVID as well. So I always look out for that these days. Well, look, thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this this Thursday evening chat with you. Thank you so much for the work that you've done previously, compiling it all into a book, for the talks that you do, which is obviously how and where we met, and also for joining me here tonight. Thank you, everyone, for watching. This has been another Topher Field podcast. My guest has been Ramesh Thakur, and I will see you again next week.
It's been a pleasure, Topher, and thanks to all the audience again. Bye.
Cheers.